You know Jim Carrey, the funniest man alive. But did you ever wonder who was behind that laugh? When the lights went out, when the cameras stopped, when the audience went home, who was left? Let's look behind the mask.
September 2017, New York Fashion Week. Jim Carrey walks onto a red carpet. A reporter approaches him, microphone ready, expecting the usual, a joke, a face, a performance. Instead, she gets something else entirely. She asks why he's there. He says he has no purpose for being anywhere. She asks what she should make of that. He says there is no she, that there is no meaning to any of it, that he doesn't believe in icons, he doesn't believe in personalities, he believes that peace lies beyond such things. The internet called it a breakdown, a midlife crisis, a cry for help. The clip went viral. People laughed at him, worried about him, analyzed him, but Carrey wasn't losing his mind. He had taken the power to say no. No to the performance, no to the character, no to being the funniest person in the room on command. He wasn't there to promote anything. He was there to simply exist, and that was so unusual for Jim Carrey that the world didn't know what to do with it. And that raises a question that's harder than it sounds. What happens when the funniest person in the world realizes that the laughter was never about joy, it was about survival? I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. His full name is James Eugene Carrey, born January 17, 1962 in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, the youngest of 4 children. His father, Percy, was a saxophone player, a man who loved music, who was good at music, who could have made a life in music. But Percy did what responsible people do. He gave up the saxophone and became an accountant. He traded the thing he loved for the thing that was safe. Jim would later say that watching his father make that trade and then lose the safe thing anyway was one of the defining lessons of his life. You can fail at what you don't love, he said, so you might as well take a chance on what you do love. His mother, Kathleen, was a homemaker who struggled with chronic illness and depression. For much of his childhood, she was in bed, taking pain medication. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when someone in them is suffering and no one knows how to fix it. Jim Carrey's first audience was his mother. He would go into her room and do impressions of praying mantises, of people on television, of anything that might work. He would throw himself down the stairs. He would bounce off the walls. He would contort his face into shapes that shouldn't be possible. Whatever it took to make her smile. Whatever it took to get a reaction from a woman who was disappearing. He was 8 years old. When asked later where his talent for physical comedy came from, he gave a one-word answer: desperation. That word is important. Not joy. Not curiosity. Not natural talent. Desperation. The comedy that would make him the biggest star in the world was born not from happiness, but from the terror of losing his mother's attention, which, for a child, is the same as losing her love. When Jim was 12, his father lost his accounting job. The family went, in Jim's words, from lower middle class to complete poverty, overnight. They lost their home. They moved into a yellow Volkswagen camper van, parking at campgrounds, sleeping wherever they could. Jim and his brother eventually spent months living in a tent on a relative's lawn. To survive, the entire family took jobs at a tire factory in Scarborough, the teenage boys working 8-hour shifts as janitors and security guards after school. Jim mopped floors, he cleaned toilets, he came home smelling like rubber and industrial cleaner. Jim dropped out of school at 16, not because he didn't want to learn, because his family needed him to work. He later described the factory as the place where he understood what his life would become if he didn't find another way out. He watched his father, a man who had given up his dream to be responsible, mopping the same floors, wearing the same uniform, disappearing a little more each day. Percy Carrey had done everything society told him to do. He had sacrificed his passion for security, and security had betrayed him anyway. Jim saw that, he absorbed it, and he made a silent promise to himself. He would not end up like his father, not because his father was a failure, but because his father had been punished for playing it safe, and that meant there was no safe route. He described himself during that period as very angry, angry at the situation, angry at the world, angry at the unfairness of watching his father, a good man who had done everything right, get destroyed anyway. But he made a choice, maybe the most important choice of his life. Instead of turning the anger outward, he turned it into comedy. At 15, his father drove him to a comedy club in downtown Toronto called Yuck Yucks. Jim wore a polyester leisure suit his mother had picked out. He performed a set of impersonations. It bombed. The audience didn't laugh. He was, by one account, essentially booed off stage. He went back. By his late teens, he was opening for established comedians. By 21, he had appeared on The Tonight Show. And somewhere in that period, he did something that would become one of the most famous stories in Hollywood. He drove to Mulholland Drive, looked out over Los Angeles, and wrote himself a check, $10 million, for acting services rendered. He dated it 10 years in the future and put it in his wallet. He carried it every day until the date arrived. By then, he was being paid $20 million a film. 1994 was the year Jim Carrey became the biggest comedy star on the planet. 3 films in a single year: Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, each one a massive hit. His face was everywhere, contorting, stretching, screaming, laughing. Audiences couldn't get enough. What audiences didn't see was the cost. 3 films in 12 months meant 18-hour days on set, back to back, for nearly an entire year. Each role demanded complete physical transformation. Carrey didn't just act, he weaponized his body. The rubber faces, the falls, the contortions. They looked effortless on screen, but they were the work of a man who had learned as a child that if he stopped performing, people would stop paying attention. By 1996, he became the first actor in history to earn $20 million for a single comedy, The Cable Guy. Then he did it again and again. Between 1994 and 2008, he earned over $200 million. The boy from the van had become one of the richest performers in the world. And then came the film that changed everything, though not in the way audiences understood at the time. In 1998, Jim Carrey starred in The Truman Show. He played a man who discovers that his entire life has been a television set, that his friends, his wife, his job, all of it was constructed, that every relationship he'd ever had was a performance designed for an audience he didn't know was watching. The film was marketed as a comedy drama. Critics praised it. Carrey received a Golden Globe for Best Actor. But the reason the performance was so convincing was not because Carrey was acting. It was because he wasn't. He was playing a version of his own life, a man who had built an entire identity for the consumption of others and was now realizing that the identity had consumed him. But here's what was happening behind the performance. Jim Carrey has spoken publicly, on multiple occasions, about his long struggle with depression. He has described being on Prozac for an extended period, and he described what that felt like in terms that are difficult to forget. He said it was a low level of despair, that everything was smoothed out, the peaks, the valleys, all of it flattened, that you could smile at the office, function, get through the day, but underneath there was nothing, just a low, constant hum of emptiness. He once said something that I think captures the core of his entire story. He said he wished everybody could get rich and famous so they could see that it's not the answer. He wasn't being philosophical. He was being literal. He had achieved everything a person could want: money, fame, adoration, success beyond anything that boy in the van could have imagined. And it didn't fix him, because the thing that was broken wasn't his bank account. It was the fact that he had been performing since he was 8 years old, and he had never been allowed to stop. In 1999, he was cast as Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon. Kaufman was a comedian who blurred the line between performance and reality so completely that no one, not his friends, not his family, not his audiences, ever knew who the real person was. To play Kaufman, Carrey did something that went beyond method acting. He didn't just stay in character on set, he became Kaufman. For the entire production, the cast and crew didn't interact with Jim Carrey at all. They called him Andy or Tony, depending on which Kaufman character he was embodying. He created separate, complete identities for each. He later said the experience was psychotic at times, that Jim Carrey didn't exist during that period. When the film wrapped and he tried to return to being Jim Carrey, something cracked. He described it himself. He said that when he tried to go back and play Jim Carrey, he got depressed. And then he said something that explains everything. He realized that Jim Carrey had always been a character too, not Andy Kaufman, not Ace Ventura, not The Mask. Jim Carrey, the person he'd been presenting to the world since he was a kid making his mother laugh, was a performance, a mask on top of a mask. Sometime in the mid-2010s, Jim Carrey started to disappear. Not dramatically, not publicly. He just stopped. Fewer films, fewer appearances, fewer interviews. The man who had been the loudest person in every room for 3 decades went quiet, and he started painting. Not as a publicity stunt, not as a new career. He painted because for the first time in his life, he had found something that didn't require an audience, something that existed whether anyone watched or not, something that was the opposite of performance. He would spend hours alone in his studio, covered in acrylics, making things that no one would see, and that was the point. The canvas didn't need him to be funny. It didn't need him to be anything. In 2017, a short documentary called I Needed Color captured this period. In it, Carrey is barely recognizable, not because he looks different, but because he acts different. He is calm, he is quiet, he speaks slowly. The frantic energy that defined him for decades is gone. What's left is a man who seems, for the first time, like he is actually present in his own life. He published a book in 2020, a semi-autobiographical novel called Memoirs and Misinformation that blurred the line between reality and fiction. He spoke about spirituality, about identity, about the constructed nature of the self. People who had known him as the guy who talked out of his rear in a movie didn't know what to make of it, but it made perfect sense if you understood his story. A boy who had been performing since before he could choose, a man who had been rewarded lavishly, enormously, for maintaining that performance, and a human being who had finally, after 50 years, asked the one question that performance is designed to prevent: who am I when I'm not performing? His answer, as he's described it publicly, was that there is no fixed Jim Carrey, that the character he'd built, the funny guy, the rubber face, the man who never stops, was a creation, an avatar, a survival mechanism that had been necessary once, when he was a desperate kid in a van, and that had become a prison once he no longer needed it. He described depression not as a disease, but as a signal. He said depression was the body's way of saying it didn't want to be this character anymore, that the avatar had become too much, that what felt like depression was actually a demand for deep rest, rest from the performance of being someone you're not. There was also a personal cost that went beyond career choices. Carrey's romantic relationships followed a pattern that mirrored his professional life, intense, all-consuming, and shaped by the gap between the public character and the private man. He was married to actress Melissa Womer from 1987 to 1995. They had a daughter, Jane. He married his Dumb and Dumber co-star Lauren Holly in 1996. It lasted less than a year. He dated actress Renee Zellweger for a period. Each relationship began with the full force of Jim Carrey's energy and ended, by most accounts, when the person behind the performance became visible, and neither he nor the other person knew what to do with that. In 2015, his former girlfriend Catriona White died by suicide. She was 28 years old. The tragedy was followed by a lawsuit from her family, public scrutiny, and a legal battle that lasted years before being resolved. Carrey has rarely spoken about it publicly, but people close to him said the loss deepened, something that was already shifting inside him, the sense that the performance wasn't just failing to save him, it was failing to save anyone. He stopped taking Prozac. He stopped drinking coffee, alcohol, everything that altered his state. He said he wanted to feel whatever was actually there, not the smoothed-out, medicated version. And then he said something that might be the most important line in this entire video. He said there is no longer any hint of depression in his life whatsoever, that depression only happens when you are playing a character in life, and he had stopped playing one. Jim Carrey grew up in a van. He made his mother laugh to keep her alive. He made the world laugh to keep himself alive. And when he'd earned enough money to never need anything again, he realized that the laughter had never been about happiness. It had been about not being abandoned. Make people laugh, and they'll keep you. That was the lesson a boy learned in a Volkswagen van in Ontario, and he carried it for 40 years. This channel has told stories of people trapped behind masks. A woman named Norma Jean, who was turned into a product called Marilyn, she didn't survive. A girl named Frances, who was drugged into becoming Judy, she didn't survive either. And now a boy named Jim, who turned himself into a character so convincing that even he forgot it wasn't real. The difference is this: Marilyn and Judy didn't make it out. Jim did, not because he's stronger, not because he's smarter, but because at some point he stopped. He put the mask down. He sat in the silence that the mask had been designed to prevent, and he discovered that the silence wasn't death. It was rest. He said his father could have been a great comedian, but he chose the safe route instead, and failed at that too. And the lesson Jim took from it was this: you can fail at what you don't want, so you might as well take a chance on doing what you love. But there's a deeper lesson underneath that one, the one it took him 50 years to learn. You can succeed at what you love wildly, beyond all imagination, and still be miserable. Because if the thing you love is a performance, and the performance is a mask, then the success doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the character, and the character isn't real. He said once that he played the guy who was free from concern so that people who watched him would be free from concern, but he was never free, not until he stopped playing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's been performing their whole life and doesn't know how to stop. We all know someone like that. Maybe we are that person. Drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. And tell me this: when was the last time you were just yourself? No performance, no mask, no audience. Because somewhere right now, someone needs to hear that the show doesn't have to go on. If you want the real stories behind more icons, subscribe. There are more masks to remove.